This week on C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast, we explore the rise of government propaganda during World War I and its lasting impact on American democracy. Louisiana State University journalism professor John Maxwell Hamilton, author of Manipulating the Masses, Woodrow Wilson and the Birth of American Propaganda, examines how the U.S. government established a systematic propaganda machine, one that set a precedent for state influence over public opinion. Professor Hamilton earned a doctorate in American civilization from George Washington University. His book, Manipulating the Masses, received the Book of the Year award from the American Journalism Historians Association. More after this.
I see you looking at me.
Can I have your attention, please? Yes, hi, Wanda Sykes here. You ever think about all the nicknames we have for breasts? Boobs, tatas, the girls, chesticles, bubbies. Heck, you might even have your own nickname for them. And yet, even though they get so much attention, they're still so ignored when it matters most. What's up with that? Well, on February 9th, tune in to see why I'm talking so much about breasts and visit yourattentionplease.com to learn more.
This episode is brought to you by Abercrombie. There's nothing better than the perfect jean and going out top combo, or an outfit that perfectly matches your plans. Abercrombie's relaxed jean goes with every occasion. Date nights with something lace, or daytime with a cozy sweater. And their barrel jean will surprise you. It's the trend that will become a staple in your wardrobe. Abercrombie denim comes in tons of rises, fits, and washes. Find your perfect pair online or in store.
So the class today is Woodrow Wilson and the Origins of Government Propaganda. And the book we're reading is, what's the book?
Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann.
Right. And we're reading this book in connection with propaganda because propaganda is what Walter Lippmann was reacting to. This is a photo of Walter Lippmann, who looks like a quite buttoned-down guy, which he was, became one of our great public intellectuals, but we'll get to him in a minute. When he wrote Public Opinion in 1922, he said, "Persuasion has become a self-conscious art and a regular organ of popular government." What happened at the end of World War I, is that propaganda became established in all developed countries and clearly in the United States, and we're going to talk about that later on. He was an ardent propagandist at the beginning of the war, and then became disillusioned at the end. So first, let's do a little of the bio. So, Emily, Jacob, what do you got?
So Walter Lippmann was born in 1889 to a wealthy German Jewish family in New York, and he lived until 1974. And he attended Harvard for his bachelor's degree, where he studied mostly philosophy, but also languages. And he was majorly influenced by George Santayana, and that's a critical realist philosopher that he met at Harvard.
In his early career, Lippmann never saw himself as a reporter, though he worked as one, but as a commentator or a political philosopher. He was a founding editor of The New Republic. It was a newspaper in 1913. During World War I, which happened shortly after that, he worked on propaganda as a captain in military intelligence in the American Expeditionary Force under Colonel Edward House. It was through his work under House that Lippmann had an advisory role on Woodrow Wilson's 14-point speech, which would outline the principles for a potential peace during World War I and would be used in that way and would be highly influential. While working as a propagandist, he is quoted to have said he had no doctrinaire belief in free speech, but was later in the war also said to have advised President Wilson against censorship. He returned from the war in 1919 and was discharged right after. He published Liberty in the News in 1920, which focused on how the press threatens democracy whenever it has an agenda other than the free flow of ideas. And he published the book that we're studying, Public Opinion, in 1922.
One of his other major works of his career was his Today and Tomorrow column, which mostly focused on news and current events, and he wrote that column for 35 years and it was widely syndicated. Then he also wrote the book Cold War in 1947, and he's credited for bringing the popularity of that term to the public. He also was awarded 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one in 1962 for an interview with the Soviet leader Khrushchev, and then one in 1958 for his wisdom, perception, and high sense of responsibility with which he has commented for many years on national and international affairs. He also received the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964 for his impact on journalism, political thought, and public life.
Later in life, some of the other things that he is known for, he wrote columns against white men's imperialism in East Asia by Western powers. That was in the Washington Post. He promoted respecting a Soviet sphere of influence, which wasn't necessarily popular at the time, and disapproved of the containment strategy that was being used at the time. He retired from his column in 1967, and he passed away, as we said, in 1974. We do have a quote that a professor of journalism at Boston University gave about Lippmann, saying that he may have been the most influential American of the 20th century to never have held an elected office. So it's something to keep in mind.
Good. So he is credited with inventing the term Cold War, but he didn't invent it.
Yeah.
It was invented by a guy named Swope, who was a journalist during World War I, actually, and was the editor of the New York World, where Lippmann worked for a while as an editorial page writer. So, okay, what's the main point of the book? We always ask that question. What's the main point? Jenna.
He's saying that the public isn't equipped to form sufficient and realistic opinion. It often struggles to form these opinions because of internal limitations and their external limitations, which the internal limitations are biases and constraints with stereotypes. And then the external is self-interest and tactics employed by propagandists. So, and then he also brings up the pseudo-environment that leads to the distorted public.
What's a pseudo-environment?
So it reminds me of pseudo-events in a way because it's just a distorted reality. Like an example that I think of is anytime that we go on social media, we don't know if it's like reality or falsehood. So that's like the environment that we live in. And pseudo is kind of a word for fake.
Right. Anybody got a good quote from the book that sums it up? Yes. Ivy.
For the most part, we do not first see, then define. We define first and then see. In the great booming, buzzing confusion of the outer world, we pick out what our culture has already defined for us, and we tend to receive that which we have picked out in the form stereotype for us by our culture.
That's good. That's a great quote. In fact, we're going to come back to that quote, exactly that quote later on. Thought. Anybody else got another quote? I see you, Vivian. You look like you have a quote.
I have one that he talks about the pictures inside of our heads. It says, the pictures inside the heads of these human beings, the pictures of themselves, of others, of their needs, purposes, and relationship are their public opinions. Those pictures, which are acted upon by groups of people or by individuals acting in the name of groups, are public opinion, capitalized P and O, with capital letters.
Yeah, good. All right, yes.
I like this one. The function of news is to signalize an event. The function of truth is to bring to light the hidden facts, to set them into relation with each other, and make a picture of reality on which men can act. Only at those points where social conditions take recognizable and measurable shape do the body of truth and the body of news coincide.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good quote. And what does Walter Lippmann think about democracy?
He says it's built on a foundation of sand. He doesn't think that in its current state the public is equipped to be making all the decisions, to have the opinions needed on complex issues, and make consistently be informed on those issues.
Yeah. We're gonna dig into that. But clearly, one of the things he also sees sees as part of that is that propaganda gets in the way of people making good decisions because they can be manipulated, because people can appeal to their bias or lie to them or in some way get them emotional about an idea rather than intellectually come to grips with it. So we're going to do a couple of things today when we go through the book. The first was we're going to look at why propaganda became important. And then second of all, we're going to look at the Committee on Public Information. And in fact, this logo here is the logo for the committee that was created. The committee was created at the beginning of World War I, our beginning of World War I, in April 1917 when the United States entered the war. The war started in 1914. And we're going to discuss how that committee came about. It is the first and only Ministry of Propaganda the United States has ever had. You can still see its offices, one of its main offices, right on Lafayette Square, 245 feet away from the White House, because the head of the Committee on Public Information used to walk over there to see the president all the time. So we're going to get into that. And then we're going to look at Lippmann's concern, which is really an old one, for why the average citizen shouldn't be involved in governance. This is not a new idea. It's actually a very old problem. When he wrote the book, it seemed like a new problem because we have now systematic, pervasive propaganda. But at the time, even though at the time he wrote this book, it seemed that way, in fact, it's a very old problem. And we're going to go back to the 17th century to see how that's the case. And then fourth, we're going to look at how the legacy of the CPI, what happened afterwards, and how what the CPI did, even though it went out of business, its ideas carried on. All right, so propaganda is old. We've always had propaganda. Every time a king put on an ermine robe or put a crown on his head, or if it's a queen, put a crown on her head, that was propaganda. It was a way to aggrandize yourself and look powerful and important to your constituents, to the public. One example I like particularly, excuse me, is when Richard III managed to get the crown of England. And he was a master propagandist. And by the way, you all know, or you should know, that he was called Richard the Lionheart, which is a name he gave himself. He liked to call himself Richard the Lionheart because it sounds good, right? It's a nice little nickname. When he was crowned, he had a hated minister who had been under the previous king. He had him put in chains and taken with him in his party as he went in to be crowned, because he wanted everybody to see that those old days were gone and he was going to be a reformed king. Actually, he wasn't that great a king, to be honest. And he wasn't around England much. He spent most of his time in Normandy. But leaving that aside, the point, and fighting wars, far-flung wars, but the point is, that's propaganda. That's all propaganda. But what changes with World War I is that the conditions around which propaganda can be made have changed dramatically. What are those changes? Well, we've talked about some of them in previous classes. Growing literacy, book production and printing, newspaper production and magazine production, and distribution systems for information. So all of a sudden you have a world in which you have lots of information circulating. You have a public square in which people can form opinions, public opinions. And when that happens, then the public starts to be important. Let me just go through some of the things that happened in the mid-19th century to understand how the world had changed. We had the steam-powered press, which was invented in Germany and later perfected in England. And it permitted mass production of cheap books, pamphlets, magazines. When World War I started, Paris itself had 57 newspapers. Think about that, 57 newspapers. We're here in Baton Rouge. How many newspapers do we have? We have one daily and one business report weekly. That's it. Germany had more than 4,200 daily and weekly newspapers when World War I started in the whole country. I'm looking at Vivian because that's her country. In Britain, literacy approached nearly 100% at that time. Members of Parliament, actually, a member of Parliament once got up and said, with all of this opinion being formed and all of this news being out there, we don't even have a job anymore. Why do we need a Parliament when we have all of these people being empowered with ideas? But of course, it doesn't quite work out that way. There's a famous philosopher named Tarde, and he was kind of a founder of the idea of sociology. He was also in the late 19th century. He said he said all kinds of people were getting information, but he was particularly focused on journalism. He said the work of journalism has been to nationalize more and more, and even to internationalize the public mind. And then he also said, one pen suffices to set off 1,000,000 tongues. And his idea was that society was being held together by this public opinion. And we've talked about this, how we people come to cities, how newspapers start, how newspapers become the glue for what becomes the way people relate to one another. It provides a context for living. especially in cities where people are often anonymous. In a village, everybody knows everybody else. But in a city, you don't. And so the newspaper becomes this way of getting a larger sense of who you are. And it's not surprising, by the way, that sociology rises in parallel with not only the growth of cities, but the growth of journalism. You don't think about this much, but the idea of mail, that you get something in the mail, we take that for granted. But there was a time in the 19th century where mail was a brand new thing. The idea of having something delivered to your house. And by the way, the British had to devise a postal system. They had a very advanced postal system, and they had to actually give houses street numbers, because you can't deliver mail if you don't have street numbers. And remember how we talked early on in this class about how the government, the first real writing we have is by governments, right, to control population, to monitor what's going on. And what does mail do? Well, actually, mail allows you now to do much better surveillance, by the way, which is a very important function in propaganda, because now you know where people live and you can monitor where they are. So we have mail, we have telegrams, we have theater, we have reading clubs, and then pretty soon, by the time we get to World War I, we have telephones. And soon after that, we're going to get radio, of course. So all of a sudden we have this proliferation of things that are happening. And the state reacts by trying to figure out how it's going to push back against it. Parliament doesn't go out of business, right? Parliament stays in business. But now they're thinking, if we have all this public opinion out there, we have to find a way to manipulate it. Governments will become bigger, because once you become a big, important industrial nation, then the government's doing more things, regulating more things. And at the same time, they also then develop the equipment to try to shape public opinion. All of those things happen at the same time. We know from what we read in Poetry and the Police that people at first often thought that it was a really good deal that we had the printing press and public opinion. Remember Mercier in the book Poetry and the Police, and this quote, which I love. He says, "Public opinion now has in Europe a preponderant power against which one cannot resist. In estimating the progress of enlightenment and the change it must produce, we can thus reasonably hope that it will bring the greatest good to the world, and that tyrants of all kinds will tremble before the universal cry that reverberates through, fills, and awakens Europe." That's a very positive thing. Public opinion is here. Everything's going to get better. It's kind of like when you think about what happened with the internet. Wow, the internet's here. Everything's going to get better. We're going to be able to find out all this information. We're going to know so much. And now what happens? Well, it didn't exactly work out that way, right? We know lots of stuff that's not true. And who can use internet better than anybody? People who have special interests. And so that's what happens in the case of this turning point as far as propaganda goes. You know, during the Spanish-American War, McKinley, who actually didn't really want to go to war, but we did, he would have newspaper clippings brought in every day so we could look at them. That's how he judged public opinion. In fact, it's an interesting finding in many research studies that actually public officials sometimes think they have a better idea of what public opinion is about by reading newspapers than they do by looking at polls. Because newspapers are considered a reflection of what people know and what they're thinking. Of course, it's kind of backwards, right? Because in fact, people are always trying to influence what newspapers do, so it's a little confused. And the Godkin essay that you read today, which we won't talk about in this class, but we'll talk about in a subsequent class, that was Godkin's point, that newspapers were a mirror of public opinion. So McKinley did it. Right before World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm did it. He would look at press clippings. French ministers did it all the time. The French also, by the way, had lots and lots of officials who had been journalists. Clemenceau, who was the great World War I leader, had been a journalist and had been a huge critic of the government. In fact, his newspaper was put out of business. This is when France entered the war in 1914. And he had a newspaper in French, it was called Unchained. But then when his paper was put out of business, he started a new one and called it Chained. But the point was he was a critic. And as soon as he becomes prime minister, what does he do? Somebody says, well, you must really believe in free press. He says, absolutely not. We're going to censor. It's fine if you're the critic, but if you're in charge, you don't want anybody intruding on you. The example I like best, because I think it's amusing, and it shows you how concerned people were, is the Prussian prince who thought that they should outlaw all coffee shops except for people titled nobility. And the reason for that was they'd go to coffee shops, and what would they do? They'd talk to each other. You know, one of the places the newspaper circulated a lot was in coffee shops. They'd be sometimes put on the wall. And the idea was people go and talk. Well, we don't want all those average people talking because they get ideas. And they might get enough ideas that they can band together to do something. Well, of course, it's impossible to keep coffee shops only for the upper class. And then, of course, political leaders co-opted journalists. They would bribe them. The French were particularly good at this. They would bribe them. They would plant false information in the newspaper all the time, the political parties. So that when you read the paper, if you go back and look at what happened during World War I, you can't really tell a lot of times what people were thinking because the news in it was so tainted and so fake. All right, so government pushes back. I said this, but I want to underline it again. Part of when the government's pushing back is because the state has become much bigger. And if you think about that in the case of the United States, let's think of Teddy Roosevelt, who's president, and then, right when the war starts, Woodrow Wilson. Both of those people were major advocates of the idea of a big, important government, a powerful government, with the president being more than just an executive, but being the originator of policies. When Woodrow Wilson, who was called the high priest of propaganda because he was so good at it, when he went to Capitol Hill to give the State of the Union address, which we all watch, that was the first time it had been done since George Washington. That was the first time a president had gone to Capitol Hill. Congress did not feel presidents should stand up in Congress and tell them anything. They were supposed to pass laws, and then the president was supposed to carry them out. Woodrow Wilson had a different view. He thought that he should lead the public, and we're going to come back to some of his quotes on that point. And it was a view he actually established, a philosophy he established when he was a professor of government at Princeton. And so, all of a sudden, the Congress finds themselves with the chief executive putting out information that gets letters that are written to members of Congress to tell them how to vote. And they were really angry about that, because they didn't like the idea that the president was going to the public and getting the public then to lobby them. And they passed a bill at one point. If we look at it today, it's kind of crazy, which was no government office, no executive office could have a PR person, a press agent. Well, what's the problem with that? You hire somebody and call them your executive assistant, and they do the same thing, right? It's impossible to control it, and we're going to get to that at the end. But they would put these in bills all the time in a way of hoping to make sure the president didn't have that power. The president does get that power. One of the places that Teddy Roosevelt did it was with regard to forests and forest preservation, which was something he cared a lot about, creating national parks. And he had a guy named Pinchot, who later became governor of Pennsylvania, who had a huge press operation to get laws passed to support conservation. And that's really, if you think about the first government press releases, really come from there. The important part is not just the press release, though, right? It's the fact that the executive is now trying to get national parks, that they're involved in every facet of our life. What does Woodrow Wilson do? He starts the Federal Reserve. What does Teddy Roosevelt do? He creates an organization to check food, to make sure they're healthy. What do we start doing with big monopolies and trusts, like railroads that had too much control? We break them up. What do we do about people who are maybe sick and living in cities? We get them health because we have public health officials. So the government starts to have lots more power, already before World War I. But then something happens, and that is World War I. And so at that point, the government decides, in a kind of amazing change of the way they operate, the government decides it's going to have a large propaganda arm. That's the Committee on Public Information. So here's what's interesting about this committee, just as a general way to look at it. it is that the idea behind it was to do what progressives had done as private citizens to carry out reform. So does anybody here know what a progressive journalist was? Anybody thought about that? We haven't talked about it much, so I'm not surprised. Well, progressive journalists were like muckrakers. You heard that term, right? They would go out and find corruption. They'd write stories about how Standard Oil had too much power and needed to be broken up, which it was. Those issues I just mentioned about health and the fact that the Senate wasn't elected in those days, or it was elected by legislatures, it wasn't elected by popular vote. That was a change in the law, a change in our Constitution, and that change was driven to a large extent by journalists who were exposing the corruption in the Senate, which was being bought and sold all the time. There were all kinds of people who were engaged in this. Lawyers. One of the famous ones was Louis Brandeis, who said that sunshine is the great disinfectant, by which he meant we need to get lots of information out there so the public knows what's going on. Because if the public knows what's going on, they will come to the right decision. That's what he's trying to tell us. Now, I think if you think about it, it's kind of naive, but it was deeply believed by progressives that this was true. One journalist whom I particularly like, Ray Stannard Baker, a great journalist who is now not remembered as well as he should be, was one of the great muckrakers, one of the great progressive journalists. He wrote on all kinds of things. But he also did something on railroads and how railroads were corrupting public opinion. Well, first of all, how they were doing things that were disadvantageous economically to the average citizen. But he also did, in a series of articles from McClure, one piece on how railroads were buying newspapers and putting out bogus information. And he said, and they called that publicity, by the way. But here's the thing what progressives did. They called what they did publicity. Today, no journalist would say, I do publicity. But in those days, muckrakers would go out and say, I'm going to go do some publicity. But by which, what they meant was something very benign. I'm going to go out and find out a lot of information the public needs to know, and I'm going to publicize these problems. It goes back a long, long way in British history where the idea was publicity could be a positive thing. So anyway, here's what Baker says about the railroads buying newspapers and doing this bad publicity. He says, the more true publicity there is, the better. For the public mind should not only be made up, it should be made up right. So there's this naive view. We give people this, we're going to come back to this, we give people information and they're just going to know what to do. You know, once we give them some good information, they're going to figure it all out. Well, we'll talk about that later. But there was a consensus among elites at that point. And you know how we now talk today about elites, and a lot of times in our political discourse we talk about elites being bad, like how come elites are telling us what to do, and is that really right? We should be using common sense. Is that a credible moment? I think a credible moment we talked about in class when J.D. Vance, who's running for vice president, says we have too many experts. We shouldn't have experts. We should use common sense. That's an old trope. That's an old idea. And it resonates with many people because elites are making decisions for us. So as I said, most of these people were journalists, many of them were journalists, but they were also lawyers. They were educators. They were people in public health. They were people who were trying to get rid of saloons because they thought prohibition was needed because there were too many people drinking. And by the way, there were lots of people drinking at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. I mean, we consumed vast amounts of alcohol. There were people who were interested in the suffrage movement, right? That women should get to vote. That's a kind of progressive, and they would write about those things. So there are all kinds of people who were progressives, but they had this common idea, which was they would bring to light social problems and help us understand. And if we understand, then we will be able to come to the right decision. So, what happens in the Committee on Public Information? That is run by progressives who had the idea the public should be enlightened. That's kind of interesting, right? Because now they're not on the outside critiquing, they're on the inside being advocates for a policy, a government set of policies. This is very important change. The progressive the Committee on Public Information, which we'll get into presently, was a who's who of progressive journalists. So I think before we go to the committee, we should look at this particular definition of propaganda. So I'm going to read it, and you can read it too on the screen. But here's what I want you to know about this. The Encyclopedia Britannica, which is a very important dictionary, effectively, had been out for decades and decades. And in 1911, the 1911 edition did not have a definition for propaganda. Imagine that. No definition for propaganda. That tells you something, that propaganda was not considered a thing at that time. It wasn't a big, important thing. The only way you really saw propaganda used regularly was in one way, the Catholic Church, which had an office of propaganda. You can still see it in Rome. And the idea of propaganda was to go out and propagandize the faith. Occasionally people use the word propaganda, but not very often. So at the end of the war, they had decided they weren't going to put out another Encyclopedia Britannica till like 1930. But they realized that the war had changed so much in our society, and particularly on the issue of censorship, war bias, and so forth. And so the editor of the encyclopedia said that the war, the perversion of facts, had cut a Grand Canyon gash in the whole intellectual structure of the world. And so they decided they had to put out a supplement. And that supplement was a 10-page, lots of tiny, small type, defining propaganda. This definition is, you have to read it a couple of times, but it's actually an excellent definition. And it was written by a guy who was, guess what, a military propagandist for the British. And he nailed it. He nailed it perfectly. Those engaged in a propaganda, I know that seems quaint, but you'll get it. Those engaged in a propaganda may genuinely believe that success will be an advantage to those whom they address. But the stimulus to their action is their own cause. The differentia of propaganda is that it's self-seeking, whether the object be worthy or unworthy, intrinsically or in the minds of its promoters. In other words, propagandists are not in the business of enlightening you. They're in the business of persuading you. That's what they're doing. So I have a couple of rules about propaganda. One is propagandists never do propaganda. Only the enemy does propaganda. Now, you might think that's kind of funny, like, could that really be so? But it is. When I was doing some research on this, I went to the archives, the Kew archives outside of London, to look at Foreign Office memoranda about propaganda, because they were better propagandists. They were probably the best propagandists in World War I, way better than the Germans, and in some ways better than us. And if you look at their memos, they write to each other, they say things like, those Germans, they're really doing a lot of propaganda. It's a good thing we're not doing propaganda. We're not good at this at all. And that's not something we would ever do. And in fact, they were doing it all the time. When the war started, within days of the war started, they created their own propaganda agency, kept it secret even from Parliament. It had no financial, there was no appropriation from Parliament. They worked secretly for a long time. They worked secretly in the United States. They had a huge branch in the United States that worked here and around the world and in Britain. And it was made up by some of the greatest writers in the United Kingdom at the time. But they believed they were not doing propaganda. And the second thing that propagandists always believe, even if they don't call themselves propaganda, is that everything they're telling you is for your own good. We tend to think of propagandists oftentimes as if they're always evil. I think there's a different way to think about it. There are propagandists who are evil. You know, Goebbels said, the great Nazi propagandist said, you know what? The great thing about democracies is so easy to subvert. And of course, part of that was the use of information to subvert it. But the fact is, propagandists don't have to be evil in intent, in the sense that they can think they're doing something good, But I think what's important is that the act of doing propaganda may be intrinsically bad. Because, as we're going to discuss, it's undemocratic. You can't have those things held together at the same time. So, those are our two rules. Propagandists never do propaganda, only the enemy does, and we're always doing it in your best interest. Okay, so now we'll talk about the Committee on Public Information. As I say, it started in April 1917. There had been very little planning for it, as a matter of fact, but it was one of the very first things that Woodrow Wilson did after he created it, which was within just a couple of days of the declaration of war. But even though there had not been real planning of it, Woodrow Wilson had been thinking about it a lot. And in fact, here's a good quote, I think, to tell us what he was thinking. In 1887, long time before the war, he wrote, "Whoever would effect a change in modern constitutional government must make public opinion willing to listen and then see to it that it listens to the right thing." Who does that sound like? Ray Standard Baker, right? 30 years later. Very same thing he was saying about the railroads. Get the public opinion, get the public to think about the right things. He had a vision of the presidency being even more predominant than Teddy Roosevelt. He had thought about it. I mean, he had a philosophical view. He actually preferred the British system, where the parliament, the majority in parliament gets the prime minister, and they don't have to worry about whether the minority becomes much less important in Congress, because there's always, by design, a majority. The majority in parliament is also from the prime minister's party. He liked that better because he wanted to be in charge. And even though he was a good propagandist in one sense, he didn't actually like the retail work of dealing with reporters and things like that. He liked to be on a podium and he liked to speak. And he was good at it and he was effective. When he ran for president, he used this phrase over and over again: pitiless publicity. He used that actually when he ran for governor, when he left the presidency of Princeton and ran for governor of New Jersey. And he would always talk about pitiless publicity, meaning we're going to find all those things that are wrong, with the bosses in Trenton and so forth, all the things that are going wrong, and we're going to find out who they are, find out what they're doing, and we're going to clean it up. Later on, when it turned out that Woodrow Wilson was using these tools to aggrandize himself, there were lots of jokes about pitiless publicity used against him. Okay, CPI. So here's where Walter Lippmann comes back in the picture. First, though, I want you to look at an image of Wilson and Creel. This is an image of them taken actually in Europe during the treaty negotiations. As you can see, they're talking rather jocularly together, and they were very close. Creel was one of the most most powerful people in Washington, D.C., which I will get into with you. He had thought a lot about publicity, and I'm going to talk about that too. But I just want you to see that photo. It's a wonderful photo. And he was a very animated guy, and he was good at telling jokes and telling stories. Even though he was hated by all kinds of people, the people who were a certain other class of people loved him because he was just a real authentic person. So his big opponent to try to take in charge of public opinion of propaganda in the war was Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann wanted the job. Walter Lippmann does not talk about this much, and it's very good Jacob brought it up, but it's not normal for his name to be attached to it. This is a picture of him when he actually then went to work for the American Expeditionary Force doing propaganda. That picture is from his papers at the University of at Yale. But the interesting thing is you hardly ever see this picture. Anyway, he had an idea of how he thought propaganda should be done. And it's an astonishing idea today when you think about it. He came up with the idea that as soon as the war started, he does this about a month, 2 months before we go to war, but when it's becoming inevitable we will go to war, he came up with the idea that the center of propaganda should be the journalism school at Columbia University. Think about that. The journalism school at Columbia University. That spring semester, the journalism school had said you don't have to go to class anymore. You don't want to. You can just start doing pre-war propaganda, arguing for the war, and we'll give you credit. Pretty amazing, right? Pretty amazing. The Pulitzer Prizes had just started at this point, and they gave a prize. They decided to give a prize for an academic piece of academic writing. It's the only time they ever gave one. And that year, they gave a Pulitzer Prize to 2 scholars at Columbia who argued that the press was doing a very good job because it was being partisan and supporting the war. That's amazing. That's amazing. Can you imagine a journalism school today saying, okay, our job is to suspend all classes and our job is to turn out propaganda? I mean, that's just the opposite of what a journalism school should do. Well, that was Lippmann's idea. And his way of making the case was through Colonel House, whom you mentioned, who was never appointed to a position. He was a very wealthy Texan, but was very close to Woodrow Wilson and a very important advisor to him up through and through the end of the war, although their relationship deteriorated after that. But he saw Wilson all the time, and he had a lot of power. And Lippmann had an entree to the White House. Lippmann and the Malcolm Colley, who was the editor of the New Republic, had a lot of entree to the White House through House, and they courted House. And House was very good at courting people, and so they had this little relationship. So House was making the case that the job should go to Lippmann.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot. We charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Oh, it's such a clutch off-season pickup, Dave.
I was worried we'd bring back the same team.
I meant those blackout motorized shades.
Blinds.com made it crazy affordable to replace our old blinds.
Hard to install?
No, it's easy. I installed these and then got some for my mom. She talked to a design consultant for free and scheduled a professional measure and install.
Hall of Fame son.
They're the #1 online retailer of custom window coverings in the world.
Blinds.com is the GOAT.
Shop Blinds.com right now and get up to 45% off select styles. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? Oh my God, it's the coolest thing ever. It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic, famous foods from restaurants across the country, anywhere nationwide. I've never found a more perfect Valentine's gift. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. Seriously. So, if you're looking for a Valentine's Day gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places. Between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Creel also desperately wanted the job of being a propagandist. He was a very aggressive, over-the-top muckraker. And he was often unfair, and he was often just wrote like a sledgehammer. He was a pretty good writer. He was a very good writer. But he was very aggressive. He had been in government once. He had been in government in Denver. He stayed on the newspaper and continued to write while he was the police chief. He was eventually forced to resign because he started attacking the other commissioners, and they told him that he had to step down. That's also very interesting, right? That the press, somebody could be an editorial writer for a newspaper and also be in government, something that would also not happen today. These two guys hated each other. At one point, early before this, Lippmann and Creel got into an argument about something, and Creel said, "You know, the problem with you is you're like a house cat, and I'm a junkyard dog." That was the difference. Well, Creel won. The reason Creel won is, first of all, he had been working with the Publicity Bureau for the Democratic National Committee in the 1916 election. That was the election that Woodrow Wilson was reelected in. By most accounts at the time it happened, everybody thought that Charles Evans Hughes would win the election, who was a famous, well-established Republican leader, former governor of New York, and also he was then on the Supreme Court. He left the Supreme Court to run. We're going to talk about him more later, too. Most people thought he was going to win, but he did a terrible job of publicity. He ran a bad campaign. I think you could argue that one of the reasons, you could certainly argue that one of the reasons Woodrow Wilson won is because he had such an amazing publicity bureau. And Creel was one of the top people in that publicity bureau. And a lot of the techniques they used in that publicity bureau were used in the Committee on Public Information. Creel was 100% in for Wilson. He was also 100% in for a guy named Josephus Daniels, who was also a journalist and owned a newspaper in Raleigh, and was also a very big deal in Democratic politics. And he happened to be the Secretary of Navy. And the Secretary of Navy had a very important reason to care about propaganda, because the Navy controlled cable lines. And so as a result of that, because they thought they were going to have British-style censorship, which was absolute censorship where the press could be censored, Daniels realized that he wanted somebody who would be in that job that would do what he wanted them to do. And Creel kept courting Daniels. And Daniels, by the way, had been heavily criticized for being a little too puritanical, like not wanting. There used to be in the Navy you could always get a little alcohol every day if you're at sea. He took that away. He believed in temperance, and a lot of the old Navy people didn't like him who worked for him. Creel defended him in the press, and so he gets the job instead of Lippmann. Lippmann then goes on and gets a job in various parts of the government, in the War Department, which is what the Army had been, and which today would be the Department of the Army, but then was the War Department. And he did kept trying to do propaganda from time to time in that job, and helped out. He had various jobs. I won't get into that right now because we don't have time. But then he eventually got a commission to go to Europe, and commissioned as a captain in the Army to do propaganda, in over-the-lines propaganda, which the Army conducted. Supposedly, it was supposed to be under the CPI, but the CPI never got around to really doing a very good job on over-the-lines propaganda. We'll come back to that. The CPI only existed during the time during the war, but it was built up to an amazing level. And I'm going to go through some of the things the CPI did because I think it's so worthwhile to understand the magnitude of what they did. Creel was a terrible manager. He was a terrible manager. Trying to get an appointment with Creel was very difficult. And the reason I love this picture, remember I told you there's this office that's on Lafayette Square? This is one of the offices. They had several. This is one of the offices. They took this picture. It's not a very good picture in terms of quality, but it's a wonderful picture in terms of two things. Look at all the people. They went from nothing to all kinds of staff doing all kinds of things. But what I really like is look at the window. You see in the window? The guy with his back turned to you? That's Creel. And you know what? Creel was so hyperkinetic that it's so perfect. Somebody says something to him and he just turns around. They're supposed to be taking a picture, but oh no, you can't get him to sit still. He can't even sit still for one picture. I love this picture. So, Creel was a whirlwind. He started out with an office in the Navy. There was a building called the Army Navy State Building. He went and worked in that building for a couple of weeks, and then eventually he got this office. And then he had offices in other places. New York, they spread out all over Washington, D.C. There was a small office in Chicago, and then they had branches overseas, which I'll talk about in a minute. But here are some of the things they did. I just want you to get a sense of this. They were a publishing conglomerate. Pamphlets, news services at home and abroad. In fact, the first United States news service was by the Committee on Public Information abroad. The AP could never send its own news abroad, American news abroad. It was a complicated story, but they never really had American news being sent abroad until after the war. They had thousands of press releases. they found all kinds of ways to pre-package news. And today, what we think of as the press release being a norm in government, they made it the norm, all throughout government. They had a division of pictorial publicity. It produced 1,500 poster designs by some of the best artists, commercial artists in the country. Cards, advertisements, seals, buttons for 98 agencies and committees. The latter ranged from the Federation of Neighborhood Associations to the Salvation Army. They distributed tens of thousands of slides taken by the military. All right, so this is a very important poster that they did. It's called The Great Mother. Of course, it kind of looks like the Virgin Mary. It was done for the YMCA. And the idea was, for the Red Cross. And the idea was to show how the Red Cross was out there helping with our soldiers and so forth. And also to not only advertise them, but of course the Red Cross needed donations. It also reached to universities. So here's a picture of Guy Stanton Ford. He was the head of the graduate school at the University of Minnesota. After the war, he went back and became president of the university. He was in charge of the Committee on Public Information's work in education. He had, by the time he got going, he had 116 professors, not on staff full-time, although many were, working for the Committee on Public Information, changing how curriculum should be done in the United States, then working on what should be done in grade schools and high schools, putting out pamphlets. And you had this wonderful statement, very good statement, about how Lippmann said, the free press, didn't care about the free press. Read that again. Do you have it right there? I had forgotten that statement, Jacob. It's a great statement.
He said he had no doctrine or belief in free speech.
Think about that. You say, how could that be? Well, in fact, the First Amendment had not really been taken up in any serious way by the Supreme Court yet. And so it was kind of unresolved how free it could be. And during the war, Woodrow Wilson, and we'll discuss that a little bit, Woodrow Wilson tried to suppress speech. Guy Stanton Ford's office created something called the War Cyclopedia, which is full of propaganda. It would say something like, there'd be a definition for Germany, the enemy. I mean, that's not exactly, but it would be like that. It was a very tendentious. But they had a definition for freedom of the press. You know what the definition was? It's at the discretion of Congress. Pretty amazing, right? Pretty amazing. So CPI piggybacked on advertising associations and other professional groups. It worked with the Boy Scouts, traveling salesmen, and corporate titans who would give money and resources to help them disseminate their information. Now, the one I want to focus on is the 4-Minute Men. What's a Minuteman? You remember from American history? What's a Minuteman? Oh, come on. The guy in Boston who runs around the Minutemen telling you the British are coming, the British are coming. It sums up this idea of people alerting you, right? So these guys and gals, but mostly guys, were 4 Minutemen. Here they are, just like in Boston. They're right there. There are a lot of posters. This is one of the CPI posters. It says Committee on Public Information under it. And the 4 Minutemen, their job was to go to movie theaters and deliver a speech between the changing of the reels. Because in those days, the reels was an old-fashioned way of doing things. The reels had to be changed. It took 4 minutes, and they had 4 minutes to deliver a message. This idea was brought to Creel within a day or two of him being in charge of the Committee on Public Information. A guy from Chicago came in and said, some of us guys, there was wealthy people, young people in Chicago, we've been going around doing this in movie theaters to try to get people to go to war. How about if we do something like this? And typical of Creel, he said, great idea. We'll do it. Right then. That guy, as it turns out, went into the war, and a guy named William Blair, came from Chicago. He was an investment banker, and he ran it, and he was a very, very good manager. And it was a brilliant job of managing, and at the end of the war, there were 75,000 4-Minute Men. 75,000 people who went out to give messages. Now, we need to remember that some of these people only maybe gave one, but there's little cards in the archives for the CPI, and you can see there'd be a name, and the name might have 40 or 50 places they went. So some people were going all over delivering multiple messages. And they were managed by Blair in Washington to the point of every week they were given a new message, like turn in binoculars. The Navy doesn't have binoculars. Donate your binoculars to the Navy. Or buy war bonds. Or look out for spies. Spies. Or make sure you use canned food. Or conserve fuel. Different message every week. And they were organized. There would be a state head of the CPI. Then there'd be in each city there would be a head of CPI. They'd meet like communist cells, actually. They'd all get together. They'd have their little messages. They'd figure out what they're supposed to do. Or if you want to use a more benign way of thinking about it, they meet the way we do campaigns in politics today. From grassroots to grass tops, right? Get everybody down there, give them their message, tell them what their rules are, and make sure you only talk 4 minutes. Very important to talk 4 minutes. They would monitor. And so this was one of the instructions they gave once in their bulletin they sent out regularly. Standing before, this is what's supposed to be a sample speech. Standing before you today, I feel like a soldier who after battle assembles with his company. Mates, we 4 Minutemen are drafted to fight an enemy at home, our most insidious enemy, the unseen, the masked foe. Because there are German enemies all over America. All over America. That's the message. That's not the truth, it's the message. To oppose a lie with the truth. So who's got the truth? The Wilson administration. Who's got the lie? The person who disagrees with policy. That is our mission, to arouse the enthusiasm of the apathetic, to instruct those who do not understand, and to throw the limelight on anti-Americanism. Be the form of that anti-Americanism what it may. So, where did these guys go? Well, first of all, it was movie theaters. But by the end of the war, it was Grange halls, picnics, logging camps, a village pool hall in North Dakota. When they couldn't get a church, the church wasn't open. There were Native American 4 Minutemen who spoke on reservations. There were 4 Minutemen in the Southwest who spoke Spanish, and other people in big cities who spoke German, Polish, Lithuanian, Hungarian, Russian, Ukrainian, Armenian, Yiddish, and Italian. When no theaters admitted blacks in Georgia, they started a black 4 Minutemen operation. Women generally didn't do it, but in Birmingham, Alabama, they had a women's auxiliary 4 Minutemen operation. The 4 Minutemen in Minnesota sponsored a contest in which students prepared speeches on buying war stamps. This led to the creation of the Junior 4 Minutemen. And these little orators went all over, and they were told to advise their younger friends to earn extra money in order to buy a war bond and to tell their parents to lend to the limit to their government. Think about that. Going to children and telling them to go home and propagandize their parents. That's what we're doing. 4 Minutemen programs popped up on campuses, including this one at Louisiana State University. In 44 states, wounded veterans had their own division. In New Mexico, they had 1,500 motor 4 Minutemen who drove around the state with musicians singing. They also had singing 4 Minutemen because people said that people want to exercise their voices in moments of patriotism. And again, these songs had instructions. And they said, make sure when you do these songs, make sure you use very patriotic ones like Dixie and When Johnny Comes Marching Home. And also, it will be well to warn the musician not to use slow time. So this is quite a feat. And the reason I concentrate on it is it shows you a lot of what the thinking of the propagandists were in the Committee on Public Information. First of all, detailed organization. In this case, making it look like it was your neighbor who was propagandizing you. So it's not some guy not some elite who came in from Washington. It's your local newspaper editor, or lawyer, or police chief, or mayor, or baker. It could be anybody. It's your own friends. So it looks like it's coming up from the ground up, even though it's being run from the top down. And of course, it kind of has a parallel with social media today, right? Think about it. You go to the movie theater, and you're sitting there, you want to watch some movie, and all of a sudden, somebody gets up and starts telling you to buy war bonds. It's non-consensual. It's like when you look at your telephone, and all of a sudden you're getting messages from people you never asked to have messages from, telling you something. It's non-consensual. You didn't invite it. but you're subjected to it. Okay, CPI did good things, and it's important to know what they were. They started the Federal Register, which you probably wouldn't be familiar with, but was an organization where the CPI had to published all documents about everything the government was doing. If they get a shoe company to make shoes for the military, and it's $1 million contract, it has to be listed in the Federal Register, or in this case, in the official bulletin. It was called the official bulletin initially. They call it the official bulletin. And so what happened was, all this, when the president issued a proclamation, it had to go in this bulletin. So it was transparent, and that's a good thing. And a democratic government should be transparent. You want to know who gets contracts. You want to know what the president's policies are. That's fair. That's fair. And so it was very useful, and it carried on when the war was over as the Federal Register. And now there are many other publications the federal government uses where they also explain what they're doing. They did public service advertising. You see it sometimes where they'll pick up the AAA, the advertising group, the AAA. They will decide that this year they're going to work on polio or black lung disease or whatever they decide the issue is, and they'll put ads. They'll put the ads together, and as a result of that, they do the advertisements for free. They're put on the air, television for free, or in magazines. That's a good thing. The CPI had the best advertising people in the country working for it, for nothing. The head of the advertising division, who lived in New York, was an ad executive, and he worked for $1 a year. So they could multiply their budget that way, and they decided when the war was over. One of the reasons advertising people wanted to do this was because it looked really good for advertising. Look how good advertisers are; they're really patriotic. It gave them a better image themselves at the same time they gave the propaganda that the government wanted them to give. They also started public diplomacy. It wasn't called that then, but they sent people overseas. One of the great heroes of the Committee on Public Information is this woman. She's an amazing woman. And by the way, she's from New Orleans. She married a very wealthy financier in New York, and she became a leader of the New York suffrage movement. And even though nobody thought that suffrage would pass, in 1917 in New York, women's suffrage, it did, and she was the leader. She was formidable. And then she went to Creel and said, I want a job overseas, and he sent her to Switzerland. She probably counts as the first woman Foreign Service officer, although the diplomats didn't want her around because they didn't think that propaganda was a good thing. They didn't want to propagandize average people. They were very elitist and hands-off about this. So it's a wonderful story. She gets to Bern. She's there. They won't let her do anything. The embassy won't let her do anything. She gets so angry, she goes back to New York, to Washington, goes to see Woodrow Wilson and gets letters from him telling the embassy they have to let him do his work. She was amazing. She was really amazing. When she went back, on the way back, she had this picture taken with the dog because when she was in London, she had it taken, and she said she wanted a picture of what will probably be my only friend in Switzerland. She was very good. And then, by the way, when the war was over, she bought a company and made it very successful, made a lot of money. She's a great hero. Another woman who was involved was a woman named Josephine Roach, who was a social worker in Denver. That's where Creel met her. And she worked closely to help immigrant groups, work with immigrant groups to make them, to propagandize them, but also to teach them, so they could learn language and so forth. Yeah.
What was the first lady's name again?
Vera Whitehouse. Yeah. And she was also good, and also a leader in the suffrage movement. Okay, but the CPI also did bad things, as you've already discovered, and we're going to go through a couple of them. George Creel always liked to say, first of all, I just say this, I've written about George Creel, obviously, and one of the things about George Creel is he's one of the most difficult people to write about because whatever he says, there's a very low probability it'll be accurate because he is so cavalier. He's more interested in being, remember our argument from Frankfurt about being a bullshitter? He's more interested in bullshitting and getting you to feel a certain way than he is to get you to actually know a real fact. And so Frankfurt could use this as a moment of as a moment to think what bullshit is. And for people in the television audience, that's a very good book. It's called On Bullshit. You ought to read it. So here's what he said. His job at the CPI was to emphasize the committee as an information service. For the Germans had grimmed propaganda until the word stood for corruption and deceit. I, however, was to spend no dollar on a secret errand or to try to camouflage a single activity. Above all, I must guard against appeals to hate. He did all of those things. All the things he said he didn't do, he did every one of them. He had front organizations. In fact, one of the things Josephine Roach did, as good as she was, is she used front organizations to work with immigrants. Groups that looked like they were immigrant groups, but they were set up by the CPI to get immigrants together to propagandize them, and they didn't even know the government was paying for those organizations to be created. They did the same thing with labor, which was very important because labor, many elements in labor were against the war. And they did the same thing overseas. Creel always denied they did these things. They did them. They had limited direct censorship in the United States. I told you in the beginning, they thought that Creel would be in charge of censorship. In fact, censorship was, and Wilson tried to pass a law that was exactly like the law that the British Defense of the Realm Act law, which allowed the British government to make anything secret they wanted to. In fact, they could make food, and they did, food served in the canteen at 10 Downing Street, a secret. Just can't tell what bureaucrats are eating. They could, and Wilson wanted to do that, and even his own party wouldn't pass it. So they had to pass a more limited, and he said I won't do anything bad, I just want to have the power. So there was no direct censorship, and Creel did not have direct censorship, but there were some places where censorship existed. The post office could censor mail. Foreign language press, of which there was considerable foreign language press in the United States, they had to use the mail so they could be censored because they couldn't, and magazines that could use the mail could be censored by the post office. Creel sat on the post office censorship board and was influential on it. Creel also sat on the board to decide how much newspapers could get. Movies couldn't be directly censored, but as the movie industry grows, one of the things it wanted to do was to be able to sell the movie overseas, right? Well, the way CPI would deal with that was they were on the board that decided whether a movie could go overseas, and a movie would be judged unfit to go overseas if it had said things they didn't want it said. So you wouldn't want to produce a movie that you couldn't export. So it was a form of censorship. There are other things like this. You get the idea. Also, because Creel was considered so powerful, when you got a call from Creel, you took notice of it. When he said he objected to something, and Creel would write letters and object, like some tiny little paper in Duluth, Minnesota, he'd write the editor a letter and say, I can't believe you just published this article. I mean, that he would even pay attention to it is outlandish. But Creel was very, very aggressive. And he was hated by journalists who, although many journalists didn't like him at all, and Republicans hated him in Congress. They hated him. Because he was also very partisan. Even though journalists were willing to be propagandists, as we've seen, they were in favor of the war. I mean, with a few exceptions, the press was very supportive. But they just didn't like the way Creel did things, and the fact he was so over the top. Then the question of hate. Consider, I want you to look at this poster. You got it there, Grace? This is a poster done by a British-born artist, Joseph Pennell. So this poster is quite amazing. First of all, for many years, people thought that this was done by Pennell for somebody else, but it actually was done for the Committee on Public Information. And he went to a meeting, and they said, we want to sell war bonds. This was to sell Liberty bonds. And there's language in there. If you looked at the original art, it's telling you to go buy Liberty bonds. But first of all, this is Germans bombing New York. There was no chance, under any circumstances, the German government was going to bomb New York. How would they get here? Planes with bombs. I mean, it's not possible. And Statue of Liberty's, you can't see it very well, the Statue of Liberty's head has been blown off and is lying in the water. And so you're meant to think the Germans could attack me right here in the United States. That's what you're meant to think. That I'm directly under attack. And remember, the problem for the United States is they could say, well, I mean, it's not my war. Why am I? That's their problem. I didn't start this. Nothing's going to happen over there that has an impact on me. And by the way, maybe the Germans have a point. But we don't get their side of the argument. And they did have a side of the argument, but they were so inept at delivering it that it was overwhelmed by the British. And so you look at this. That's the subtext of this message. Here's another one that is also pretty stunning. So Germans were very important to the development of the American higher education system. Lots and lots of people, including people who were professors who worked at the Committee on Public Information, went to Germany to get their doctorates. That was a very important thing to do. And Germans were actually great citizens. They were prosperous, they were responsible, they were, their communities were tidy. I mean, they were actually they were model citizens. They did have their own organizations. They did tend to speak German. They went to their own churches. I mean, you could see them as being a little separate sometimes. But they were very good citizens. Then all of a sudden, we have to portray them as not being good citizens. Now remember, Creel says we don't promote hate, right? So here is a headline from, don't put it on yet, Grace, wait one second. Here is the beginning of this headline, of this ad, that's for college students. Remember, I just made the point. The Germans were very good at higher education. This is for college students. And it was an ad to get them to buy Liberty loans. And it starts out, this isn't in the quote, it starts out this way. In the vicious guttural language of culture, what's that mean, Vivian? Culture. Yeah, culture. The degree AB means Bachelor of Atrocities. Are you going to let the Prussian python strike at your alma mater? By the way, that's quite a metaphor, right? Because pythons actually strangle you to death. They don't bite you to death. But anyway. And now here's the rest of the quote. The Hohenzollern fang strikes at every element of decency and culture and taste that our colleges stand for. It leaves a track so terrible that only whispered fragments may be recounted. It has ripped all the world-old romance out of war and reduced it to the dead, black depths of muck and hate and bitterness. I mean, that is amazing. That guy got carried away. Whoever sat in the CPI headquarters and wrote that, they got carried away. They weren't all that bad, but you get the point. CPI was also tendentious, meaning they only give you one side, one opinion. And by the way, it's good for me to stop and say something important here. Propaganda has two sides, and actually Creel says it in the Public Opinion. You may not have noticed it because it's a big book. But anybody remember what he said? There's two ways to look at one is censorship, right? And the other is the provision of information. The goal of a propagandist is to get you to think something. And there's two ways to get you to think it. To suppress information or to give you information that they want you to get. CPI obviously does both of those. So they had a kind of a slogan they put out all the time, which was you needed to listen to official facts. Official facts. That means facts that the government is telling you because they're official. They're real facts. They sent out a column that was syndicated. It was written by a playwright, a very good writer, called Official Facts, and it would be published in newspapers like a syndicated column, like Dear Abby or something, or like a columnist would write, like George Will. Wilson and others, and the CPI too, when they saw something, when they heard something that went against their policy, they called it enemy talk. Enemy talk. What would be the equivalent of that today? Huh? Oh, hate speech? Well, or how about something else? Fake news, right? When we say something's fake news, a lot of times it's not fake at all. It's just something that's inconvenient to the narrative that we're trying to convince you of. So we call it enemy talk. Think about how slippery that is. Anything anybody says, we don't know how that happened. Like, how did the enemy tell us this? I mean, who told you this? Did Saad tell me that? I mean, is he the enemy? I mean, where would he have gotten that? Who told him? Right? It's a very insidious way to think about how you can begin to become paranoid about what's going on, because you got these people lurking around. By the way, anybody want to guess how many spies, all this talk about spies, how many spies do you think were caught during the war? Huh? One spy. Only one spy. A stupid guy who tried to cross over with crappy passport to come into Mexico, and he got caught, and he was going to see if he can get all the people in the southwest United States to create a band to rise up against the United States. One guy. And they didn't kill him. They just put him in jail for a while, and they let him out when the war was over. I mean, he was a threat to nobody. One spy. All of this talk. We know the Espionage Act. We've heard of people talk about the Espionage Act even now, right? The Espionage Act was a way you could put people in jail because you could say they were doing things to impede the war effort. That you could do. Espionage, it wasn't really directed at spies. It was called the Espionage Act, but there weren't spies. It was directed at people who were doing enemy talk. There were a lot of provisions in the Espionage Act, but that's part of it. And what the CPI did was non-consensual. This is very important. You could not avoid hearing or seeing something the CPI put out. If you went to a movie theater, it was there. There were posters everywhere. You saw it in your newspapers. They would oftentimes just publish CPI, not only the column I just mentioned to you, but they published CPI press releases. I'll stop and give you a story about this. White Russians, the Bolsheviks overthrew Russia, the Red Russians. We were against that. The United States were against that because the Russians the communists took Russia out of the war, which meant there was no longer a second front. And so we did not recognize Russia. And we supported the White Russians, which we hoped would overthrow the Bolshevik government. Some White Russians got together and came up with these series of fake documents. They're called the Sisson Papers, named after a CPI official who was working in Russia. CPI official thought he had gotten this trove of documents that were mind-blowing because they showed that Lenin was being controlled by Germans, like secret meetings and things like that. And they were all fake. And the idea was the Germans took, really, the Bolsheviks aren't even really Russians. They're really just Germans. They took them out of the war because they're not even patriotic Russians. They were bogus. Sisson brought them back to the United States, and they published them over a period of a week. And many newspapers, including the New York Times, published them verbatim. Verbatim. The whole reports, just put them all in the paper. And they were all fake. We think about disinformation today, right? Like how is our elections influenced by foreign powers? I mean, that wasn't the case of our election being influenced, but it was a case of trying to influence our public opinion. And the Wilson administration wanted them published because it was confirmation bias. They wanted them to be true. At the end of the war, Will Irwin, one of the great journalists of his day and a muckraker himself who worked for the CPI, said, "We never told the truth, not by any manner of means. We told that part which served our national purpose." And then I want to say one more thing about consensual. The guy who was in charge of all the CPI advertising was a guy named William Johns. And he sent a postcard back. It's in the files, CPI files, when he was driving out in the West. And he sent this postcard back. And it's a really good example of how you couldn't avoid CPI propaganda. He says he was marveling that he had seen the famous Red Cross poster of The Greatest Mother, the one you saw here a couple minutes ago. He said, "I saw it in the windows of towns on the prairies, towns hardly as big as this postcard, out in the flat, arid lands." So that's the CPI. I think you have a pretty good picture of what they did. There's some good things. There are some good things. And they were well-meaning. One of the interesting things about the CPI is there really isn't anybody that I could identify in the CPI who I would say was purposely trying to do something they thought was wrong. They all thought they were doing the right thing, taking us into the war and maintaining our willingness to continue to fight at the end and not accept a negotiated peace. And I think many historians today would argue that a negotiated peace would have been much better than an absolute victory, because World War I produced such an unfair peace to the Germans, to the losers, that it gave them a foundation on which to start another war. But Wilson did not want such a peace. He did not want to negotiate peace because he wanted to use the peace process to establish the League of Nations. But what he had done in the same time is he had built up such expectations overseas and in the United States for what would happen. And when he couldn't meet those expectations, for example, by instead of liberating China from the Germans, giving concessions in China to the Japanese, and other things he did that were seen as unfair, sacrifices he made to get the League of Nations. And because the victors, the European victors, the Western Europeans, had their own agenda of things they wanted to extract in that peace that were unfair. I would argue were unfair. I think many historians would agree with that. And so, in the end, expectations were very high and they weren't met. And that led to profound disappointment. We never joined the League of Nations. In fact, we never signed the peace treaty. The peace treaty was never signed. Several years later, in a kind of tricky little way, we acknowledged that there was a peace treaty, but we never signed it after all of that. Okay, so now we're going to go back to Lippmann. As I said, this all seems like an urgent problem. And it all seems like a new problem. The press is doing what it's doing to support the war. The government is propagandizing much more effectively than Richard III did. But there's actually an older problem here. And I want to go back to the early 17th century. And I want to go back to a guy named Nathaniel Butter. He is considered responsible for the first regularly appearing printed newspaper in England, 1622. As soon as he published that paper, the term buttered news appeared. Fake news. Because he published all kinds of stuff that was wrong. They had no standards in those days, and they were still trying to figure out what news was. But he published this material, and so did a whole lot of other people in due course. And so buttered news became the term that was often used. And it would be ridiculed. They would talk about how news was buttered on latrine walls or on, toilet walls, things like that. And then we have our first press critic, Ben Jonson, the famous playwright. Some of his plays were about news. Like one's about a hoax that people live on the moon. And in one play, he has a character. And the character, these are some quotes from the play. The character wants to laugh and be fat, like butter. The news is as good yet as butter can make it. In a word, they are beastly buttered. When butter's paper finally goes broke, it melts into butter. These were plays that were put on at the court. His concern, Johnson's concern, wasn't just about, and this is where we start getting to where Walter Lippmann comes in, wasn't just about the fact the news was fake. His concern was that there was news at all, that there was what was called news thirst, that people could hardly wait to go to get news. They would go to St. Paul's Cathedral, which in those days you could go in the nave at certain times during the year, during the day, and people would be in there spreading gossip. Butter sold his paper in the courtyard of St. Paul's. St. Paul's was actually called, I think it was called the Mint of All Lies. But Johnson's concern wasn't just that. It was concerned they were getting any news. There cannot be a greater disease in nature or a fouler scorn upon the times than news.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment.
When your makeup's so loud, you can literally hear it. That's NYX Professional Makeup. To capture that sound, NYX has spotlit 5 rising female artists, collaborating with each one to create music for the debut NYX Tape, an album inspired by the latest NYX professional makeup drop. NYX Tape, the sound of NYX professional makeup. It's makeup so loud you can hear it. Listen now on Spotify.
This episode is brought to you by Tic Tac. Close your eyes and take a ride with new Tic Tac Citrus Adventure. Awaken your senses with harmonies of sour and tangy fruit flavors. Picture the vibrant trio of mandarin, lemon, and lime as each flavor mingles to create a refreshing symphony. Pick up a pack and dive into new Tic Tac Citrus Adventure. Visit @TicTacUSA on social to share the good vibes.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. From streaming to shopping, Prime helps you get more out of your passions. So whether you're a fan of true crime or prefer a nail-biting novel from time to time, with services like Prime Video, Amazon Music, and fast free delivery, Prime makes it easy to get more out of whatever you're into or getting into. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to learn more.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kann du noch?
If you've heard that sound from Babbel before, I bet you do. Babbel is the science-backed language learning app that actually works. With quick 10-minute lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts, Babbel gets you on your way to speaking a new language in just a few weeks. With over 16 million subscriptions sold and a 20-day money-back guarantee, just start speaking another language with Babbel. Right now, up to 55% off your Babbel subscription at babbel.com/Spotify podcast. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify podcast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
So, what was the solution? Well, we know some of these from our books we've read, right? You can license, you can put people out of business. In the case of Bacon, he went to jail a number of times and died very poor. And sometimes he was just, they were told he couldn't publish anymore. But now I want to get to the third character that becomes very much like Walter Lippmann. And this character is hardly ever, in fact, I've never seen him associated with Lippmann, but he should be all the time. And this is Francis Bacon. So Francis Bacon is considered the founder of the scientific method, or the first to write about it, in which he's talking about not that we're going to deduct deduct truth from some fact, we're going to induct, right? In other words, if God made the earth is really important, then everything must go around it, right? The sun must travel around the earth. That's sort of deductive reasoning. And he said, no, we have to have inductive reasoning. And he became a very, very important figure in the idea of scientific thinking, objective scientific thinking based on facts. But here's the thing. There's two things about Bacon that are very interesting. He was one of the most brilliant philosophers in history. He was lionized in Britain and abroad because of his writing. He was the first essayist, by the way, too. First person to write, considered the first British essayist. But he also had another job. He worked for the court. And he was a big climber. He really wanted to be powerful. And so, when he was on the job at court, he dissembled. And he even wrote at times that sometimes, you shouldn't dissemble, but in certain cases you just need to. And there's some famous cases where he actually had a mentor and he supported him, and then the mentor got in trouble with the Queen Elizabeth, and they put Bacon in charge of prosecuting him. And Bacon went after him. It was the Earl of Essex. And during the trial, the Earl of Essex says, I call to the witness stand Francis Bacon to talk about Francis Bacon. Basically, he's such a bad guy. Let's bring him in here and find out what kind of guy he is. Anyway, Essex lost. He had his head cut off. And Bacon didn't. Right away, at the end of his career, as a matter of fact, he lost it. He was in charge of the whole judicial system at one point. But at the end of his career, he lost his point. He lost out because he had been giving favorable treatment to certain people, and he had made a lot of enemies. A lot of favorable treatment was given, but it was an excuse to get rid of him. All right, but here's what I want to say about Bacon. Not only did Bacon talk about the truth, Bacon wrote about what can go wrong. Now, I want you to listen to what he says. First of all, he says, by the way, he doesn't care about people much, right? In fact, he even says at one point, he says, I do not love people. I don't love people. I love elites. They're the ones who should decide stuff. He talked, by the way, he didn't like public discourse. With rumors, partisan songs, false news, they were all signs of trouble. So he wrote a book called The New Organon, and in it, he outlined problems with public opinion. Now remember, there's no democracy, but there are still people, and they're getting ideas, and ideas can be a problem. And of course, what happens later on in the 17th century? There is a revolution in England. They reinstall a king later on, but for a brief period, there is a revolution, and that requires public opinion. And so he hits all the main points that Walter Lippmann does in public opinion. By the way, the term organon is derived from a title of something that Aristotle wrote, who believed in deductive reasoning as opposed to inductive reasoning. And he calls these idols. And to our word, idol sounds funny, but what he was meaning was false ideas or fictions, phantoms, delusions. So he calls these idols of the mind. Okay, here we are. Idols of the tribe. These are quotes. The human understanding, when it is once adopted an opinion, either as being the received opinion or as being agreeable to itself, draws all other things to support it and agree with it. In other words, confirmation bias. Idols of the cave. People live in a cave or a den of their own. People's understanding is limited by their personality. This isn't a quote. This is their personality, their education, their acquaintance with whom they regard as authorities, as well as by the incidents in their lives. Does that sound like Walter Lippmann? Exactly, right? And then idols of the marketplace. This is a quote. It is by discourse that men associate and words are imposed according to the apprehension of the vulgar. Can you remember what Lippmann says about that?
Codes. That's codes that he talks about.
Yeah, and also that language is imprecise. Language is imprecise. We don't have a good enough vocabulary to be able to describe complicated things. So, all of these things are here. Words are imprecise. Stereotypes. What does Lippmann say about stereotypes? Anna, what does he say about stereotypes?
They're created in our heads, and they tend to simplify like complex ideas whenever we're separated from the reality of those ideas.
Right. We have to find ways to simplify reality, so we stereotype. We have one way of thinking about that we try to work against, which is like stereotyping people, right? But we also can talk about, you know, when you come into a kitchen, you just don't put your hand on the stove without checking to see if it's on. Because it's kind of a stereotypical idea. Stoves can be dangerous, so I better always think about it. There's lots of ways in fact, if we didn't, some stereotypes are terrible, but if we didn't stereotype, it would be hard to live, because if we didn't have certain general conclusions about how things worked, it'd be a problem. But that's right, stereotypes. People arrive at decisions that are in their self-interest. Let me talk about that. Yep. And they look to false authorities that can easily manipulate them. Lippmann talks about that. So here are two quotes. One is the one that Jacob gave us. That's terrific. For what a man had rather... Oh, sorry. This is Lippmann's. We do not first see and then define. We define first and then see. It's a great quote. Here's what Bacon says. For what a man had rather were true, he more readily believes. It's the same quote, effectively. But 402 years earlier is when this was written. So what does that tell us? It tells us there's a problem with what? With the public being involved in decision making. So, okay, what's Lippmann's solution? All right. Go ahead. Explain it. Yeah, you.
The bureaus of intelligence, essentially, he appreciated the elite, although he did note a few things that were issues, but he felt like an educated public, if we all are on the same page and getting the right information, then that would put society in a better state collectively and also change public opinion as a whole.
Right. So we find these people who are like progressives, right? Experts in health, in education, in law, and mechanics, whatever it is. And they should be making these decisions on how, and economists and sociologists, all these people, they should be helping us make decisions because they are trained to do it. Now, just kind of think about it. What kind of guy do you think Lippmann is? He's an elite. He's an elite. He's absolutely an incredible elite, right? Here's a story about how he became a journalist. When he's at Harvard, studying, a famous muckraking journalist named Lincoln Steffens comes to Harvard and says to the president, I'm going to conduct an experiment. Everybody in my newsroom says the only way you can be a good journalist is you have to go out and cover, fires and stuff like that. But I don't think that's true. I think you'd be a good journalist by you just get somebody smart and just send them right out and start covering big stories. So he interviews 2 people. And when he's done, he takes the one guy he picked, he takes him back to his magazine, and the guy's working with him a little bit, and then he has the guy go write a magazine article. And he turns it in with his own name on it. Lincoln Steffens has his name on it. And of course the editors look at it, they go, oh, okay, that's fine. And then just about to go to press, they change it. He says, it's Walter Lippmann. That's how Walter Lippmann got his, he had worked in a small paper while he was in college. That's how he got his start. He was an elite. He was hanging around with Santayana, like you said in your thing, like when he was at Harvard as a kid. And he comes from a wealthy family. And he goes to work right away for the New Republic, which is like the top. One of the great magazines of his time. And he's a progressive. He's a progressive. He becomes less of a progressive as he gets older, although he still could be certainly criticize the government. And one of the reasons when he retired, it was an unhappy retirement, is because he fought against the war in Vietnam and so angered LBJ and others who were in favor of the war, his life became rather miserable at that point. He was very courageous at the end of the war. But he's an elite. And he's very happy as an elite to have elites make decisions. And he's very happy, by the way, if he could be making the decisions. Who had the quote that he was like the most powerful public official or non-elected official?
Oh, yeah. That was from Christopher Daly, a professor at Boston
University. Yeah, that's a great quote, right? He would love that. And he often continued, even later on when he was a journalist, to work behind the scenes with government officials. He'd like to be in touch with government. He'd like to be a player. That was very important to him. He related to those people. The reason he didn't like Creel is exactly what Creel said. Creel was not anything like Walter Lippmann. He was bombastic. Walter Lippmann was there with his little bow tie and very together. So now let's talk about bureaus of intelligence, though. That also is not a new idea. In some ways, of course, we can see it in Bacon, right? Bacon liked the idea that this group of people make decisions. That's important. But at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, progressives got together and they started creating organizations like the Brookings Institution. Carnegie, when he made his gifts, like the Carnegie Endowment and so forth, Carnegie Endowment for Peace. These were created as institutions filled with experts on topics. That's what they were there for, to help us come up with good policy ideas. And since then, Washington's full of these so-called think tanks. Okay, so what's wrong with the solution? Vivian.
Those experts are biased themselves, and they could hold a tremendous power over public opinion and influence it. Because if they have sole control, who's going to control them?
Exactly. And where do they get their money? The Heritage Foundation gets its money from people who expect certain kinds of outcomes, right? And people who are in left-wing organizations, think tanks, they get their money from people who expect a certain outcome. They don't expect the outcome to look what would be at the Heritage Foundation at all. And there have been other foundations think tanks like Brookings, which has gotten some money from oil, I think it was oil interests. But Should they be getting money from somebody who has a special interest in the outcome? Maybe not. Yeah.
And also, like, an expert can be an expert, like, only on a few topics. Like it said in the book, like, it's not like an expert can be the knower of everything. Like, they might be specifically good at 3 things, but not everything.
So that's a really good point. Because sometimes you don't just solve a problem by looking at the problem itself. You have to solve it in another way, right? In other words, there are consequences that go beyond just being an expert on pipelines. There's a lot of other issues that become involved. Yeah.
There's also the issue of agenda setting and agenda framing. If you are elite or if you're a part of one of these organizations, then that by its definition means that there's a group of the public that's being excluded or does not have access to the information in its raw form, meaning that there's an altering or manipulation of the information.
It's been intermediated. Yeah, that's right. That's a great point. That's also the case. So, and we know today, people are writing books about it. We know today that think tanks are themselves instruments of a point of view. Oftentimes, that doesn't mean that experts can't help us. I actually am a big believer in experts helping us. But we also have to understand that experts don't always agree. And we have to see the broader connection of this. So then let me ask you a question. He does have this point at the end, right, about bureaus of intelligence. He says it's a really good idea. It's just as his book appears at a time when propaganda is an issue and the press is being subverted as an issue and so forth, even though it has old roots. So does his think tank idea or bureaus of intelligence idea speak to what was happening at the same time. It's just that he was able to write a classic because he brought it all together in a brilliant way. I mean, the book's, you may not agree, I think the book is beautifully written. I mean, some of the allusions maybe get away from you. Like, for example, what does he mean that people sketch in the coastline of Bohemia? Where is Bohemia? Vivian, where's Bohemia?
Oh, well, now in Poland.
Oh, well, I think it's the Czech Republic.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
True.
And how many oceans are around Bohemia?
None.
So people get the idea, I love this line, people get the idea of something. They start thinking about Bohemia. There must be a coast at Bohemia. So they start thinking about, yeah, I know Bohemia. It's like this place with a coast. But it doesn't have a coast. You just thought it had a coast. It's a great line because it shows us how we sketch it in, but we don't have any basis for fact. We don't have any real experience. We've never been to Bohemia. We have no idea. So some of these I know could be lost on you because the book's 100 years old. And the allusions, I mean, Bohemia's never had a coastline in knowable time. I mean, it may have been once. But the book captures something very important that's happening. It brings all those things together. But now I want to just go to the very end. He tells you about bureaus of intelligence, but then what happens at the very end? Gina, what happens at the very end? Where does he end up? What does he say? What does he say? Anybody remember? It's easy to overlook it. What does he say? He's kind of telling you, okay, we've gone on this whole trip here. We've told you all these things, and now we're here, and so.
Do you mean like the conclusion?
Yeah.
It's so interesting. He says the hero in politics has more future before him than there is recorded history behind him.
Yeah, and he's saying we have to kind of get along and figure it out, right? So I think of Lippmann as like driving this car. And he's driving, and he tells you, oh yeah, well, public opinion, people, outside forces can tell you things and manipulate you. You don't have enough time to do things. And then there's internal problems, you have bias and so forth. And as he's driving, he picks up speed. He's going faster and faster. And all of a sudden, he looks in front of him, and he says, uh-oh, there's a cliff. And he puts on the brakes. Because if he took the book to its logical conclusion, he'd be saying, we're screwed. Democracy doesn't work. We got people, look at how people vote. They just vote. They make terrible decisions. How can we have a situation like this? We need elites to figure this out, but that's not going to really work. And so he just says, okay, but people will figure it out. People will figure it out. Now, there's something very all-American about that. Like, there's got to be a solution for every problem. And in fact, he continues to wrestle with this problem. In his next book, he does drive over the cliff. It's a short little book called The Phantom Public. Then later in life, he kind of comes to learn to live with it. And he also becomes so important that he's one of those elites who's telling people what to think all the time, so maybe he feels better about that. That's kind of a joke. But the point I'm trying to make is, at the very end, he can't bring himself to drive over the cliff. But he's built this incredible case of why democracy can't work. And of course, what's the problem? The problem is that what's the alternative? That's the problem. Just as we can say, sure, we could have a different system, but it's not that we're ever going to get a perfect system. The question is, which is a relatively better system? And Lippmann doesn't have an answer for that problem. Okay, now we're going to bring this to a close by going over some of the issues that tell us about what happened after the CPI. So it goes out of business. Actually, in some ways, it's too bad it went out of business. It would have been good if it stayed in business a little longer because it could have helped Wilson sell the treaty. But Creel had made so many people so mad, and Congress had finally gotten control of its budget. Initially, its budget had actually been in Wilson's wartime budget, which had no controls over it. But Congress got the budget back, and they just wanted Creel gone. And a lot of Democrats did too, because he was just too incendiary. He would just do all kinds of things that would make people angry. But what happened, of course, was the CPI's functions carry on. We never again had a centralized ministry of propaganda. There was some thought about doing it in World War II, but we didn't. And one of the reasons we didn't do it was because everybody still remembered what the CPI was like under Creel, and they didn't want to have to deal with that anymore. The memories were still too fresh. But also, it is true that decentralized propaganda can work better because each unit then knows what it's trying to do, and then you have to have some coordination on major policy issues from the White House. But all of the things that happened from the CPI that they did are done today, just done in a different managerial configuration. So, one of the things that happened after the war was concern, of course, and the development of public relations and advertising. The war was Carl Bayer, who was at the CPI, very interesting character. He is considered one of the founding fathers of public relations. The other founding father is Edward Bernays. You probably all know that. Edward Bernays worked at the CPI. He's the one who invented the term public relations. There were also people out there, of course, who were very concerned about public relations being invented or carrying on, becoming a very big business. And one of those was Frank Cobb, who was the editor of the New York World, but also at the same time he was working for the New York World, was very supportive of the Wilson administration and very supportive of the war behind the scenes. He was also very respected. But in those days, these roles were a lot more fluid than they are today, and we didn't have rules like we do today. This is from a speech he gave after the war at a club in New York. And he said, he decried the fact that government propaganda had, and remember, he was involved with it. This is what's important, had goose-stepped public opinion, and the private propaganda, that is, private companies doing propaganda, were also proliferating. Before the war, he said, the number of publicity agents could be counted. How many are there now? I do not pretend to know. But what I do know is that many of the direct channels of news have been closed, and the information for the public is first filtered through publicity agents. So you remember when you read the Shudson book, remember that tension between the fact that journalists all of a sudden said, wait a minute, we provide information, and public relations people provide information, so what's the difference? And it's at this time that journalists start to get ethics codes and an idea that their job is to be fact-based. That's where this is a very professional, a moment of professionalization of the media. So, another thing that carries on. Remember how I said Creel was involved with the Publicity Bureau during the campaign? The guy who was the head of that bureau was a very interesting guy named Robert Woolley. Robert Woolley's in the back there. He was a journalist for many years, came from Kentucky, came from a Democratic family of Democrats, actually started a newspaper in Lake Charles at one point, in the days when, you start a paper, it goes out of business. He then ended up working in government. He worked on publicity for Creel's, for Wilson's first campaign, and then he headed the Bureau of Publicity for the 1916 campaign. He was the lead guy, and he was a genius. Even the Republicans said he ran the best publicity campaign that had ever been run. Not because he was just creative, but because he was so well organized. And he got information to all the people he needed to get it to. And we have a presidential campaign just behind us a few days ago, and we can think about what that means to get information to the voters and reach them, and he was a genius at it. He had all kinds of mechanisms, and he had some dirty tricks he played and so forth. And he had Creel, who would write bombastic stuff attacking the opposition and just over-the-top things. Well, the important point I want to make is that sometimes people say, in campaigns, people talk about things. But that never really matters when you get to be president, because you have other things to deal with. The famous case is during the Kennedy-Nixon race. There was a big issue about Quemoy Matsu, these two tiny islands off of Taiwan, who would defend them and all of this. And it got all kinds of press. They bring it up in debates. It was never an issue after the election. Quemoy Matsu just wasn't on the agenda. But in one way, it is true that what happens in a campaign carries on, and that is how the campaign communicates. How the campaign communicates has a lot to do with how the president ends up communicating. Think of Barack Obama. He was a master at using social media. When he comes into office, he creates an office of social media that has more people in it than the press office. Think about Donald Trump's 2016 campaign, where he used Twitter and all kinds of techniques to directly reach voters. How you communicate in one place determines how you communicate in the other. In the case of the Committee on Public Information, much of what they learned to do, they learned from doing the publicity work they did, the detailed management publicity work they did under Woolley. I personally think, just an opinion, Woolley would have been a much better choice to actually have headed the committee, because he wouldn't have maybe been quite as creative, but he would have actually worked together more, I think, with the Republicans in a better way. And I think he would have made it a less toxic, perceived to be a less toxic organization. The next picture we have here is a guy named Charles Merriman. So Merriman is also an interesting character. Merriman was a political scientist, specialized in government. He was at the University of Chicago. He ran for alderman at one point, didn't win, I don't think. But he was very good at using data to think about how government should run in campaigns. He was sent, remember we talked about Vera Whitehouse going to Switzerland? He went to Italy. He had a rather grand impression of himself, so much so that he would run around and tell people that they really shouldn't pay attention to the ambassador, they should just come and talk to him, which made him persona non grata with the ambassador. He also had a very lovely mistress he took up with, and he was very flamboyant. He actually ran a pretty good bureau a propaganda bureau there, but he was eventually sent home because the ambassador just got sick of him. That aside, he is considered the author, the pioneer of data-driven modern political campaigns. And here is a quote from him. "It is clearly in evidence that the science of creating and transmitting public opinion under the influence of collective emotion is about to become the principal science of civilization, to the mastery of which all governments and all powerful interests in the future will address themselves with every resource in their command." Can anybody think of a presidential campaign that will not be doing exactly that or hasn't exactly done that? We become better at it all the time. Slicing and dicing the electorate, trying to figure out who they are, tracking, is this demographic group going to be different than the other? Yeah, Vivian.
We were actually talking about that yesterday in our AI class, and I wanted to bring it up earlier when you said getting the public to think about the right things. We're talking about how Cambridge Analytica used big data in the 2016 campaign for Trump's opponent, or like the other Republican candidate that ran, Ted Cruz. And how they developed this ocean model that determines, or that kind of plays into your fears. It clusters people according to their different personality traits. So they said, like, I can compose direct messages for every voter in the United States according to their personality. And they compared the Second Amendment, like 2 messages for the Second Amendment, carrying a gun, sorry. One was portraying, I mean, essentially the same message, just playing into their personality. One for like an erotic person that says vote for, or like don't let the Second Amendment get banned because it's your security insurance or security policy or something like that. And the other one was for like a very a person that is very traditional, that shows a father and a son. In the back of the picture, it's like it tells like vote for the Second Amendment and pass it on from like a father to your son or something like that. So I found that very, very interesting how they use data to run a campaign and to target people. Apart from the side that they leaked Facebook accounts to get to that data, but yeah, I just thought I'll bring.
Well, that's great. That's a good point, and that's all Merriman, right? The idea of not just going out and writing a really good speech. You know, I mean, how often does this one speech do much? But it's more figuring out how to analyze the electorate so you can persuade them using highly scientific data. It's almost like you may know this. You know, lawyers spend a lot of time when they're selecting a jury looking at all the juries, their backgrounds of each juror, and deciding which ones they want to challenge because they want to get a court that they think will be made up of people who are more likely to agree with them. Not just this naive idea. We just put our peers up there and they're going to decide. We're thinking, which peers do we want? And we don't just care if they, we're not just saying one of the jurors said, I've already made up my mind. Well, obviously you want to challenge that juror, but we're saying something much more profound than that. That person comes from this socioeconomic background. They're more likely to respond to these arguments in this way. Only now magnify that when we think about how you run a whole campaign. And and AI is going to just magnify this even more. So I want to reiterate another point about what's gone forward, which is good people do bad things. Good people do bad things. That's why when Woodrow Wilson said, I'll never use this Defense of the Realm Act, if I had it, I would never use it for ill. When you really want to get something done, it's pretty hard not to resort to using all the levers you can resort to. Here's what Creel said in a speech after he was after the CPI was put out of business, right? He said, you want to put it up there, Grace? That's Creel. Well, I guess you don't have, okay. I don't have the quote up there. I'll read the quote. With the existence of democracy at stake, he said, there was no time to think about the details of democracy. With the existence of democracy at stake, there was no time to think about the details of democracy. That was one statement he made that he was telling us absolutely what he was thinking. Okay, what else? Well, what happens in Vivian's example is a good evidence of this. What happens with propaganda is it becomes cumulative. It becomes an arms race. I use social media. He uses Twitter. We use AI. It's constantly trying to advance ways, using new techniques, often what you learned from the past campaigns, to do a better job. And of course, now globally, propaganda has become an arms race, not just in putting out your own propaganda, like, the Soviet Union would send out a magazine called Soviet Life that looked like Life magazine because we could read it and maybe think something nice about the Soviet Union. Now they use bots and disinformation. And we do too. We don't like to talk about what we do, but we do it too. Everybody does it. It's a weapon of war. It's a weapon of war. The Pentagon used to think war was important, information was important to find out what the enemy was doing, and you drop some leaflets. They now think that strategic communication is as important as what arms you have, because those weapons have become so effective, or the propaganda techniques have become so effective. As a result of this, we are in a kind of dilemma that's a very important one for democracy, even when we're not really thinking about it in terms of just a specific kind of propaganda at a specific moment, like in a war, but when we're thinking about how our government works. And this is very, very important. A good government, a good democratic government, is obliged to provide lots of information. That's what a democratic government does, at many different levels. Candidates need to stand up and say what they stand for. They need to stand up and say what their agenda is. That's good. At the more routine bureaucratic level of government, we need all kinds of data from government. We want to know what trade statistics are. We want to know what health statistics are. We want the agriculture department to tell us that these kinds of foods may be bad for us because they've done surveys. We want the Department of Health or the Center for Disease Control to be doing investigations to acquire information that we need to know how to deal with it. I mean, some people may be upset that at certain times during the pandemic, the CDC put out information that wasn't quite right, but their motives were always good. And the fact is that data was very important to us in terms of creating vaccines. And we need them to do that. And if the government didn't do it, it wouldn't get done. The government has the resources. In fact, the government really is the only one that has resources to give us trade data, right? Or monitor weather all around the country. I mean, you're not going to get every little city to have its own advanced weather station. Democracy requires information. But all of that apparatus can be used also to propagandize us. That's the problem. And so then you say, oh, well, we should draw a line. But how do you draw a line? I go out and give a speech. I'm from the Labor Department. And I go out and give a speech. And I'm talking about what's going on in the labor force these days and, what some of the issues that people in the labor force are up to. And during that, I say, you know what? And also, members of Congress really need to pass a higher minimum wage law. That's not a statement of truth. That's a statement of opinion. So I'm using taxpayer dollars to go out and tell you not only facts, but to tell you what to think. We're paying the government to tell us in that case, to tell us what to think. Or, as has happened sometimes, Department of Health goes out and pays somebody to pretend they're a journalist and do public service announcements that support the Department of Health's agenda, where a journalist actually faked. It's not really a fake, it's a fake. That's clearly out of bounds, by the way. There are laws that forbid that. But the problem is it's very hard to decide how you draw the line. And how are you going to enforce that? Well, first of all, for it to be enforced, what would have to happen? Two things. First of all, somebody'd have to bring it to the Department of Justice. It's somebody in your administration who just went out and did this. Do you think the Department of Justice is going to go and start policing everything somebody says out there? No, they're not. Now, Congress could do it, but there's another problem with that. When your side is saying something, even if they're using taxpayer dollars, your side, if it's the president in your party, you don't care. I mean, you're fine with it. If you're in the minority, you can complain about it, but you're never going to get enough votes to actually do anything about it. And in any case, writing the law is very difficult because this is a very blurry line. We do have rules that say if you're going to give a campaign speech, for your boss and you're the Assistant Secretary of Treasury, you can't use government money. Okay, fine. That's fine. But what is that, that doesn't cover all these other cases that could exist. And just think about this. As an example, during the pandemic, we sent out checks, pandemic checks to people. What did the president insist on doing with those pandemic checks? He insisted that he sign them himself. That's propaganda. Yeah, generally, this gets signed by somebody in the bureaucracy, right? Why do you think we have so many military bans? Military bans used to exist, right? We talked about this in class. Military bans exist to get people to go to war. But now they're used to entertain people. We spend a lot of money getting people all excited about listening to military bands. We don't really need them, except once in a while for parades. So the government there's this huge power that resides with the incumbent and with the administration to make a case for their point of view. And we have limited capacity to rein it in. First, because it's hard to draw the line. And second of all, even if you draw the line, how do you really enforce it? That's a problem. And we should be mindful of it when we watch what our leaders do. And just so I could be clear, yes, Donald Trump signed those pandemic checks. Every president does this. They all do it. It's a bipartisan activity. Okay, and then finally, we get cynicism. When you feel you're being propagandized all the time, you start to become cynical. You start asking yourself, what's true? What's not true? You lose trust in the institutions. As the institutions become more partisan, as they become more propagandistic, as they find new ways to trick you, it's not the term of art, but it's a term, right? New ways to manipulate you. Even if you find yourself believing what they say at any given moment, the subtext of that is you become cynical. And it's very corrosive to democracy. Harold Laswell, who was one of the first great students of propaganda. He didn't work for the CPI, but he wrote a book in the mid-1920s that talked about propaganda during World War I. It was one of the first in English to be done. And he's a sociologist. And we've talked in class about how sociologists spend a lot of time studying mass media. That's one of the things they do. And he was one of the greats. And a whole new field, in many ways, the study of what we study here, mass communication and all that, comes out of World War I. And the fact that all of a sudden these issues of how the media works and how public information works started to become more urgent and more complex. It wasn't just, we believe in the libertarian theory, if the press just does its job, everything will be okay. It's not that simple, right? As we've learned, which is why we had the Hutchins Commission report and all of that. So here's what Laswell said at the end of in his famous book. He said that all the discussion of the ways and means of controlling public opinion testified to the collapse of democratic romanticism. That credulous utopianism had in many minds given way to cynicism and disenchantment. It's a good quote. He's basically saying, at the end of the war, just like the Encyclopedia Britannica said, a big gash, a Grand Canyon gash had taken place in our society about truth and how it could be manipulated. So I want to end with a guy who I think is an exemplar, and that's Charles Evans Hughes. He's sometimes called the human iceberg for reasons you can tell by looking at him. He's a very formidable character. He was a brilliant corporate lawyer. He was brought in, because nobody else would do it, to investigate trusts, both in insurance trusts and utilities in New York. And he was brilliant, and he was utterly scrupulous. And when it turned out that Teddy Roosevelt, who Hughes was a Republican, when Teddy Roosevelt had been involved in one of these things, not because he was unscrupulous, but he had been involved, and people came to him and said, you can't bring this up in court today or during the investigation, during the panel, because it'll just look terrible. He said, I'm bringing it up. He went on to be governor of New York. Then he went to the Supreme Court as Associate Justice, and then he ran against Wilson. And if he had just won California, if he had just gotten like 3,000 more votes in California, he would have been president. But his campaign staff was so stupid, they wouldn't have him go and meet Hiram Johnson, who was the former governor of California, who was running for the Senate, who was a very important figure in California, but was a progressive, and a lot of Hughes people in California weren't. And they didn't tell Hughes that he was at the same hotel that Hiram Johnson was in. And Hiram Johnson was really angry. And Hiram Johnson sort of helped him. But if Hiram Johnson had gone full behind him, he would have been the President of the United States instead of Woodrow Wilson. He then went on and became Secretary of State under Harding. And even though the Harding administration did not distinguish itself, he was considered at the end of his life, in a poll by historians, one of the 3 best Secretaries of State we ever had. And one of the things he did, he had the first international arms control agreement ever. He organized that. And then he went and became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And we look at, in our classes here, we look a lot about how the First Amendment evolved. But often he doesn't get as much credit as he deserved, because all of these important First Amendment, many of the important First Amendment decisions that made it clear that Congress doesn't decide what free speech is, that the Constitution guarantees free speech, came under Hughes. So I'm going to end with a quote by him, but I want to give you one anecdote, which I like a lot. After the war, half a dozen, 5 or 6 socialists were elected to the New York Assembly and the legislature. And this is a time of witch hunts against communists and labor unrest. And labor felt they had been taken advantage of during the war because they didn't get pay raises, but businesses made a lot of money. And that was another element of disillusion, going to war, but finding out that a lot of the progressive ideas had disappeared. And so the assembly would not seat them because they were socialists. And Charles Evans Hughes took up their case on his own. He had nothing in common with socialists, but he had a lot in common with principle. And the principle was they were elected. And when you're elected, you get to be seated. That's pretty strong. Taking a decision based not on your preference for somebody's point of view, but based on principle, is a big deal. Something that really is what democracy is all about. By the way, he lost the case. That's how people felt in the country at that time. But he was right. And so, to end this class today, we'll just give you a quote from him, which he said after the end of the Great War. The question is no longer one of establishing democratic institutions, but of preserving them. All right. Next week, we'll have another class. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find even more history content, visit our website at cspan.org.